The Lord of the Rings of the Lord of Power, Episode 3 is out. And again, if this is your first time here, welcome to the second channel where we can be more casual and relaxed and just talk. What did you think of the episode? Let me know down below. Episode 3 is broadly divided into kind of three storylines. We've got Galadriel in Numenor, we've got Nobody Goes Off the Trail with the Hobbits, and we will get to that, and we've got Arendir's prison down in the Southlands. I think the first couple of episodes suffered from what I'm going to call like the first chapter problem, you know, where you're introducing characters and the conflict and the world all at once, and it's really easy to fumble that, especially because problems stick out more, we notice them more, we're more willing to criticize them when we don't love the characters of the show, and we don't know these characters yet. Like Doctor Who, a show that has a dear place in my heart, let's be honest, has some appalling writing at times, but one thing the Doctor Who does really, really well is characters. We always love, like, the main cast, and so people just kind of excuse it, we kind of just look past it because we like spending time with those characters, but we don't really have that so much with Rings of Power. I think that's also why Episode 3 felt a lot more cohesive and focused, because, you know, we weren't jumping around from plot beat to character we don't know to character we don't know, because this episode was largely focused on Galadriel arriving in Numenor. And it gave us a lot more time to explore the city, to talk with Elendil and Hellbrand and her. There were more scenes of exposition, but I think they worked better in episode 3 because they felt a lot more natural, like when they're arriving in Numenor and Hellbrand asks, "What is this place?" and Galadriel says, "This can only be the island of the five-pointed star, you know, the greatest civilization of man." That's a lot more natural because Hellbrand wouldn't know. This is information she would naturally communicate to him. But we got a lot more scenes where characters were allowed to just talk and feel and reflect, and those were the strongest scenes in this episode, you know, especially with Elendil, which is why I think he's had a pretty warm reception amongst fans. But Numenor, right? It looks stunning, and I think they really captured Tolkien's vision for this place. So it might not look like it, but Numenor is in a pretty dark place in its history at the moment. These Numenorians, these great men who have risen out of the First Age, they are angry at the elves because they get to live forever while we supposedly have to die. How the hell is that fair? So they kind of get a bit obsessed with, leaving their mark, with their own mortality. There's this jealousy and arrogance because they go, look at everything we have done, all we have accomplished, we deserve to live forever as well. So they start colonizing and building these huge statues to themselves. They are so concerned with their own grandeur and glory that they forget their spiritual roots, their values. And I think they really captured that in the architecture of our Menelaus. So we also see how they refer to other humans, from Middle-earth as low men, and they describe themselves as people of better breeding. That arrogance really comes through. The elitism is great, and purely aesthetically, the cream and blue and gold color palette was stunning, and I mean, Tolkien described Numenor as culturally Egyptian, Atlantean, Greek, and I think they really brought that to life in this architecture. We can see also cues of kind of like the Minas Tirith type style of building with this pointed balcony. We've got these domes, the largeness of their building, it all really fits. One thing that seems to come up in fantasy adaptations these days is that everything feels too clean, that there's no sense of use, of wear, of time in the sets and the costumes. This was definitely a problem in the Wheel of Time series, but I don't think that really applies here because, Numenor is the pinnacle of human civilization in a way. It is meant to be unusually perfect. It is meant to hide the rot underneath with this kind of surface level beauty. Nerd of the Rings also pointed out something really interesting because the only part of the city that is in disrepair is the building around the Tree of Nimloth, which is a symbol of their relationship with the elves and the Valar, who they do not like now. So like with Khazad-dûm, I want to applaud the Rings of Power for really capturing the spirit of Tolkien's world building when he really didn't give much detail. Elendil is probably the highlight of the episode. He's well acted, he's interesting, and he's hot. Yeah, so he has this Tolkienian nobility to him, and what I mean by that is that Tolkien loves exploring good people who are in very hard times. He likes people who have the right values and are pushed to their limits of like whether or not they can keep to them. And sometimes they fail, you know? That is the story of Isildur. That's the story of Fëanor. And Elendil is one of the last faithful on Númenor. The faithful being this group of people who have kind of kept to the friendship and ways of the elves and the Valar. So seeing how Elendil navigates this political and cultural morass, keeping the memory of the past but not alienating himself from the center of power, that's interesting, you know? It's also why he seems to only really be at ease when he's talking with Galadriel. Though there is one funny thing I have to mention. So Elendil, his son, and his daughter all have 3 very different accents. Like, Elendil will be like, "Oh, son, you've got to get on the boat." And his son will be like, but I don't want to be on the boat, Dad. And his daughter will be like, "But you've got to get on the boat." And it's funny because it's like, I mean, how does that make sense? The episode ends with Tamira going to her father and saying, "The moment we feared has come, the elf has arrived." And this isn't the books, but it suggests that there's some kind of prophecy or foreknowledge of what is to come, and this is like the first sign of it. And I don't know what they're going to do with that, but it did bring to mind one line from The Two Towers, which said, "Kings made tombs more splendid than houses of the living, and counted old names in the rolls of their descent dearer than the names of sons. Childless lords sat in aged halls, musing on heraldry. In high, cold towers, they asked questions of the stars." And what do we see in Númenor? We see this obsession with mortality and continuing on, and we see people looking for guidance in the stars and in signs and things like that. And I wonder if that's playing into here. And so there's kind of a parallel between, you know, the decline of Gondor and the decline of Númenor to come. Spoiler. None of this means that the episode was perfect, and I want to talk about what I'm going to call shallow writing here. Not bad writing, but shallow writing, in 2 moments. First, when Isildur hauls the Númenorian boat up onto the beach, and the sailors turn to the ocean and they cry out, "The sea is always right." It's meant to be kind of this Númenorian mantra. Now, Númenor is a naval civilization at the height of their power and glory. And I felt like this was kind of an underwhelming reflection of that. Like, I want to compare it to the Greyjoys from A Song of Ice and Fire, who are also a seafaring civilization who revere the ocean. They have a lot of ritualistic words in the same way. You know, one person will say, "What is dead may never die," and the others will reply, "But rises harder and stronger." And this is in reference to drowning. There's a poetry to that I feel The Sea is Always Right just doesn't have. And if there's one thing to describe Tolkien's writing, it is poetic. Then later on in the episode, you know, at the half-foot migration ceremony, they start singing a song that goes, "Nobody goes off trail, nobody walks alone." And that's it. It's just those 2 lines over and over. Poetry and songs were such a big part of Tolkien's world. There's a real magic to them. And I felt like both of these were sort of missed opportunities, you know? Like, Tolkien literally wrote a poem called The Road Goes Ever On, which is about hobbits wandering and finding their path. Let me read it to you. "Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and star, yet feet that have wandering gone, turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known." It was written by Bilbo, so maybe they couldn't have used that, but even if they did, it would have been a really nice reference that thematically I think better captures what they're depicting in the first place, and it's still Tolkien's words, and a song with a lot more depth than what we got. In both of these cases, it lacks a depth that I wish it had. It feels a lot more surface level. See, we have all of this stunning world building in the visuals, you know, in these sweeping shots, which have so much attention to detail that I really love, but it feels like when we get to these actual scenes that allow them to explore the culture of these places, it's just a little bit shallow. And it's not all of the time, but it is some of the time. And this feeling of it lacking depth is a recurring one for me. Like, the Númenorians could have said something like, I don't know, "The oceans rise and take us with them," which just has a little bit more meaning and poetry to it. It's got a little bit more subtext and layers, you know? I don't know. I asked Willow and she said that, yeah, there were some clunky scenes. Like there's this one where two guards are talking and they say, you need to go tell Tamriel that Galadriel escaped. And the other one says, I did it last time. And then, that was a dog. Which is just odd dialogue, I don't know. There's also the scene where Hellbrand gets beaten up, and it plays out identically to a school bully scene in like a kid's film, you know, where they shove the person to the ground and then they pick them up and grab them by the shoulders and then the leader punches them. It was oddly infantile. And these were just two examples that really stood out to me, but the more I think about it, the more I do feel like there's always a lot happening in any given scene, you know, but it's not necessarily character or relationship or that depth that I really think it needs. It's often interrupted by plot or exposition or whatever's needed to push us on to the next scene or beat. And it's not taking the time that I personally really need to get to know and care about these characters. And we do get glimpses of that, you know, with Elrond and Galadriel or Elrond and Durin. But it's just not enough for me yet. Not 3 hours into the series so far. But let's talk about Hellbrand, shall we? So he is currently the fan favourite for who is going to turn out to be Sauron. And there are a few more decent hints in this episode that he is Sauron. You know, in the first one, his first line is, looks can be deceiving. In the second one, you know, he's asked, like, and what's your name? And he says, depends, because Sauron has a lot of names. And in this one, he's walking through the town and he sees a bunch of smiths. And he goes, I should be a smith. Please let me be a smith. I'll be the best smith you have ever met. I will make so many good weapons. And they say no. Now, Sauron was a Maiar who was kind of under Aule, the Valar of smithing and creation and technology. So that very much fits in with the Sauron character. And Saruman was as well. See, it's a common theme in Tolkien's works for the people concerned with technology and mastery and organizing to kind of turn to evil, to dictatorship, because they assert themselves over the natural world rather than live in harmony with it. This is something we see with Numenor eventually as well, because, you know, they are basically the most advanced civilization in Middle-earth's kind of mythology. But alternatively, he could just be really into smithing. We don't know. See, in this episode, we are told that he is actually the king of the Southlands. Kind of a new Aragorn figure. And initially I was kind of like, all right, okay, sure. But then I thought, you know, they could do something really interesting with this storyline, okay? So Hellbrand goes and becomes the king in the Southlands. He unites all of the tribes to fight against Sauron, and he fails. He fails where, like, Aragorn succeeded in The Lord of the Rings. And I think that would work because, you know, thematically, the story does seem to want to explore how, you know, the Southland isn't just purely evil. They're trying to do this kind of redemption arc for the Southlands, and this could be a tragic but really meaningful way to explore that. I don't know, though. Who do you think Sauron is? And would you prefer that to be Hellbrand's story? Because I think I definitely would. It sort of feels like he's almost too obviously meant to be Sauron at this point, that I'd prefer they did something different. We do get introduced to Adar down with Arondir, and that means father to the orcs, and we're clearly meant to think that this is Sauron, but that just makes me think that he isn't Sauron. I think that Adar is probably just some one-season villain. I don't know what they're going to do with him, we'll have to see. Now, talking about Hellbrand, there has been a lot of speculation that there might be some kind of relationship between Galadriel and Hellbrand. And there are some scenes in episode 3 that could be read as having like a sexual tension subtext. I really hope that that's all just kind of a mistake, that that's to do with the framing. I don't know. I would be quite annoyed if they did that. I don't think that's the right decision for the series personally. But let's talk about Galadriel, okay? Let's talk about her. I struggled a little bit more with Galadriel in this episode. See, in the first 2, her anger and how she treated others was very clearly rooted in her grief, which was a lot more understandable. Whereas I felt like she almost pointlessly antagonized Numenor and Tamriel in the court scene. It felt childish, you know? I could definitely imagine her being cold and aloof and unhelpful and distant. but this felt a little bit like a step too far. And again, it's not necessarily bad writing, but I don't think it's necessarily a good idea for adapting her. If the writer's intention was for us to like her as a character, and to be honest, I don't actually think that is necessarily the case, not at the moment, but this wouldn't be exactly the way to do it. And that is actually why her scenes with Elendil were so much better, so much more interesting, because we got to see a different side to her. We got to see her being gentler and listening and talking. I think she has a big arc to go, and I'm glad that we're finally getting scenes where that gets developed. That being said, I'm still pretty lukewarm on her, whereas I do actually quite like Nori. How do you feel about Galadriel at the moment? But okay, let's talk about Nori and the brutality of the Harfoots, which is an objectively funny thing to say. Okay, so on the one hand, I think this episode had some of the most Tolkienian scenes. You know, the one where they're having a party and they're remembering their fallen. It felt very Hobbity. It had a Hobbity kind of humor to it. Though that might be just because of the obvious similarities to like Bilbo's party in The Fellowship. I don't know. I am enjoying being around the hobbits, though, in this episode more than the last. The line where he says, you know, I've heard of people turned into a star, but not the other way around. It was quite nice. I quite liked that. They're charming. I also really liked the Celtic and Druidic influence in this episode. I thought that was a creative touch. But on the other hand, the brutal way of life of the hobbits. So the hobbits chant out in this episode, you know, nobody goes off trail, nobody walks alone. And in the first episode, someone says, you know, our hearts are as big as our feet. And in this episode, we find out that they will 100% abandon you if you fall behind, even if you're on the trail. And at first I thought, oh, okay, they're just talking about the people who died, because, you know, when they're listing the people who they lost, it's people who died to wolf attacks or to landslides, things they couldn't control or influence. But no, because Nori's dad breaks his foot and they're sent to the back of a caravan, and nobody offers to help them, even though everything up until this point is implied they're like a tightly knit community, and that is how tightly knit small communities like this survive. You know, they have to rely deeply on each other for when any one of them gets injured. I don't know if the writers intended this dark implication, but it's what I got. And I gotta say, I don't feel like that was the right decision for the hobbits, who are, you know, kind of meant to represent this kernel of innocence in the world, both in the Rings of Power and in Tolkien's wider mythos. I think ultimately the likelihood is that it was a bit of a narrative contrivance, like they needed a reason for the stranger to pull their caravan, which is a nice sentiment. It's a character bonding moment, and it's a beautiful idea that this kind of like bewildered person picks up and helps this tiny little person just out of the kindness of their heart. They're learning to trust and rely on each other. It's nice. But they could have done that differently, you know, without this dark implication. Like maybe the Harfoots reach a chasm, which has opened up in the year since their last migration, and they don't know how to get across. But then the stranger, who has been following them for quite a while, emerges, and he helps them get across. And they're kind of terrified at first, but then they learn that, oh, maybe they can trust this person. And you could use the chasm to foreshadow some other danger in the area. I don't know, but it was an odd adaptation decision to me. Arendir's prison is the last story. It doesn't take up much of the episode, which was the right decision because it's not that interesting, but it does have two really cool little details. Number one, the fact that the elves don't want to cut down the tree. We've never really been able to explore on screen, you know, the really interesting relationship between the elves and the natural world. And so having this beat I thought was good, and it complicates Arondir's character, makes him more interesting. Two, the fight scene, all right? So when they're trying to free themselves, the elves kind of flip over and whip the chains at the orcs, and then they also cross over all of their chains at once into kind of this perfectly symmetrical image, and then they're going rhythmically hacking at it with their hammers to break the chains. And I really loved that because I've always imagined, you know, the elves to move and fight with a kind of dance, a rhythm, a beauty, a beat. And I thought this captured their elegance, even in moments of tension, you know, an elegance that humans don't have, really, really well. And not to mention the orcs look fantastic and feel like a threat. But how do we bring all this together? I think at the moment, if you took away the spectacular sets and music and, you know, effects, Rings of Power comes across as just a little bit shallow. Like, I'm yearning for more depth and breadth and complexity to the characters and the stories, but also on a scene-by-scene level, with a bit more subtext, a few more layers. Like, in Arendir's story, it's mostly, oh no, there's orcs. In Galadriel's story, we know that she is on the hunt for Sauron. And even though I know that Numenor has a really interesting political situation, because, I've read the book, I don't feel like we've had that communicated just quite yet. We don't have a huge amount of depth to the different sides, what different characters want, and how they come into conflict with each other. One of the reasons that Elendil scenes are so much better is that we get to see a bit more of that with what Elendil wants, and what Isildur wants, and what the sister wants, and what Galadriel and how that fits into that. I thought those were good. And it's also partly why, the Halfwoods, funnily enough, are better on this front. We have Nori and her friend, we have Nori and her family, and the conflict between the family and kind of the wider group, and Sadok and the stars and the stranger and everyone. There's a lot more strings going in a bunch of different directions. And what I really want in a story is I want to see those strings and feel them pulling at our characters in different directions. But we're 3 hours into the series, and I'm not quite sure we've got that complex web of tension that I really hope we get more of. I don't know how to explain it. Do you know what I mean, though? I am enjoying it. There are really great parts to it, but I just want there to be a bit more depth. I'm really yearning for that. I don't know. I'm gonna keep watching it. What did you think of the episode? Let me know down below. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.